Vice Minister for Mozambique. And let me say this, that I had the privilege of being associated with the leadership of Mozambique when they were still a Portuguese colony. It's a country with immense goodwill for India, with whom we never have any differences, with whom I think our economic development cooperation is running, and a very wise and continuing leadership. I mean, leadership transitions from Samora Machel to Chissano onwards have been extremely smooth and indeed an example for the rest of Africa. But again, I will leave that to dwell on him. So I'll pass it on with that. I think I've said my 10 minutes and 2 pennies worth. And ask Dr. Salim Al-Ismaili to come and join us and let us have the benefit of his view. One point I'd like to make. Everybody is saying good things about our development cooperation projects. There's also the bad. There are frequent instances of delays in project assistance. And I hope our foreign friends will be honest to tell us what they feel about it. Mr. Karzai will tomorrow perhaps, because the construction of his parliament by our wonderful CPWD is delayed by over a year. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, I think I should stop here because you've already spoken about the bilateral relationship of Oman and India. It's wonderful to be back in India, and I must confess that this is the first time I am in Pune. When I first started visiting India a few years ago, you could buy any car you wanted as long as it was an ambassador car. It used to come with a guarantee that the first 6 months, nothing makes noise except the horn. After that, everything makes noise except the horn. However, now things have changed. And I might say, for the better. When we started economic development in Oman, everybody was warning us that next door you have a giant called India. You will never make it. But then, even a giant like India cannot be competitive in every sector. And therefore, we had to work with India to identify what areas that the Indians need. For example, as His Excellency the Ambassador have said, fertilizer. India is the second largest consumer of fertilizer. Unfortunately, they don't have natural gas enough or sufficient enough to produce that. So with IFCO, we started a joint venture in Oman and created the first real business bilateral between Oman and India in the modern history. At that time, our bilateral trade between Oman and India was less than $100 million. Today, it's over $3 billion. Recently, we have started a fund between India and Oman in a modest way with $100 million, but it is going to go up to $1.5 billion in order to identify business opportunities in India, especially in infrastructure and small and medium enterprises. Almost every Fortune 100 companies from India are present in Oman, whether in the area of infrastructure, oil and gas, information communication technology, manufacturing, tourism, retail, financial services, you name it, they're there. And the reason is simple. If an Indian business person crosses the immigration desk at the Omani airport and still does not feel at home in Oman, then we have failed. Ask those who came. When I started my professional life, the per capita in Oman was $245. And I'm not that old. Today is $30,000. $50,000, equivalent to any of the Western countries, European countries. How did that happen? I would like to share with you the recipe that we have taken in Oman to get where we are today. And don't tell me that it cannot be done. And don't tell me that you didn't have colonial past. And don't tell me, that because you have oil. I know many countries in the world that are rich with a lot of poor people. What we had was a vision. And this is where we started. The first thing that we embarked was investment in people, education, which is deep-rooted in our religion. We, as Muslims, believe that God created pen before a human being. Our Prophet always said that the ink of a scholar is holier than the blood of a martyr. It is better to spend 1 hour in search of knowledge than the whole night in worship. And investment in people means investment in people. It doesn't mean investment in boys or men. It has to include women. If you educate a person, if you educate a man, you only educate a person. But if you educate a woman, you are educating the whole society. Forever, what I have, the minimum that I have achieved in my life, I attribute that to my mother. In our small family, she made sure that we all had the education. In our small family, we have a jet pilot, electrical engineer, computer scientist, and even a dumb person like me could have achieved doctorate degree. Imagine again, my mother never went to any formal schooling. Had she been educated, could have been something different. So that was the first program. What we did was investment in people by making sure not only can the people read or write, but can also have the skills to do things. I was just asking my friend there, Christine from SU, what would have happened in Burundi if nobody was educated? How can you be competitive when you cannot read or write? You're just going to be marginalized. The second thing, which is the equal opportunity. I know it's easier said than done. But who are you to marginalize me when my mother has born me free, just because of the color of my skin, or my faith, of my political affiliation? We in Oman believe any person who lives in Oman has the potential to contribute to the economic development of our country, whether that person is Omani or not. And therefore, that person should be given the opportunity, equal opportunity like any other person. And those equal opportunity, not only legally, but also through the financial incentives, so that we don't impose unnecessary burdens in forms of taxation for non-Omanis or other non-burials, tariffs that are imposed by non-nationals. And therefore, we have flat rate of taxes for Omanis and non-Omanis, for Omani companies or non-Omani companies. Imagine if you were to say today that a particular gender cannot perform women in your development agenda of economic development. You are all doing is limiting your potential to 50%. If you are industrialist here, you will know that. And imagine that if you say that, well, because you are Shia, you cannot get involved in this particular activities. You are further diminishing your potential to even another percentage. Therefore, equal opportunity is one of the milestones of our economic policies for everybody who lives in our country. We have moved and we have made some trends in our development, but also we are stuck right now in the middle income trap. Oman will not be able to move from the middle income trap if they do not follow the third pillar, which is investment in science and technology. There's nothing that will take you further if you don't know how to do things better. Let me remind you of a small story of somebody by the name of Abdel Fattah Ganduri. He's a gentleman from Homs, Syria, who, because in his country did not have an environment that was conducive to do research and development, especially innovation, he immigrated to California. There he met a young woman, American woman, got married. For some reason, they had to divorce, and the son was put for adoption. That son today created a company that is the leader in technology, especially information technology. His name is Steve Jobs. I wonder how many Steve Jobs are still in Syria trying to get out because there is not an environment that is conducive to doing business. Why should we wait until there is a corruption? Why should we wait until there is a war breaking out in order to realize our potential? And therefore, that is part of our pillars of economic development. Policy of peace. No country prospers in war. People do. Companies do. But not countries. By the time I finish my talk, those forces of alliances in Afghanistan would have wasted $10 million. This is what they spend every hour in Afghanistan. Imagine if that $10 million was done or invested in useful use. From the beginning, the basic law of Oman, which is close to our constitution, has a chapter that says the economy of Oman will be based on justice and the free market. In this area, we mean the rule of law. If you and I were to sign a commercial contract, God forbid that you and I had a dispute, we will be governed by what we have signed through the court, through the rule of law, and not undue influence. No government official in Oman is above the law. I know every country there are corruptions, but the difference between one country and another is what you do after you discover it. And look at our track record. We have put ministers behind bars. Fiscal and financial policies. It's very important that if I were an investor and I am in your country, that the government does not rob me through imposing undue taxations. If they are reasonable taxation, they are accepted. But you have some countries where the more you produce, the more you penalized. Why do you want to penalize those people who are most productive in your society? If you ask some of the very people here in their countries, which sector that is more important to you in your economy, and then go and examine that sector, you will find tons of taxations, either directly or indirectly. And that is the most important sector. How do you expect that particular sector to be competitive? How are you expecting that the people will come and invest in that particular sector if you keep penalizing them through, imposition of taxes? Ease of doing business. I work for the Investment Promotion Center. And when I started, I came up with a brochure as a marketing tool. And then some of so-called experts came up with beautiful words and buzzwords that says, well, come to Oman. It has economic stability, strategically located, etc., etc. It means nothing. Pick up any brochure of any country, it will say the same thing. They are strategically located, there is political stability, etc., etc. But the ease of doing business, is important. How long does it take me from the day I decide that I want to invest into your country and from the day that I close my company and get my commercial registration or licenses, whatever it is? That's what's important. How accessible are those decision makers? Do I need them in the first place? Can I register my company anywhere, anytime, without seeing an individual? Do you have these systems in place? Because if you don't, what you're going to do is to empower an individual in a public office and utilize that public office for private benefit. You don't want to do that. Depend on a system rather than a person. The system stays, the person goes. The size of the government. Governments have no business doing business. When they get involved in business, they crowd the private sector. And the private sector will ever remain weak. The government should be behind the steering wheel, but of the boat, behind, not in front. The engine of growth and economic development in any society is the private sector. And I must say that I was a bit surprised and disappointed to see that even here we have been disintegrated, separated. I can see reserved, VIP, corporates, faculty. Use this time to network with all those people because they are the ones who form parts and parcel of our society. We are nothing up here without them. We need them. I know I'm not going to get invited again here to come. Last but not least, you can have all of this, but if you miss a champion, it won't happen. And as has been witnessed, God, we have a champion in Oman, His Majesty Sultan Qaboos. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ismail. I'm sure both the Congress and BJP are happy that you won't come here and stand for another election because that was inspiring. Thank you very much, and we expect that from Oman. Another person very closely linked to Oman will follow you, my friend Talmiz. As he heads for the podium, let me say, in the rest of the External Affairs Ministry, when we discuss the Gulf and Talmiz speaks, everybody listens. So let's have him now. Thanks.
It is a pleasure to be here again. This place has a special place in my heart because I was in that room in 1969 when Professor Majumdar announced the setting up of the Symbiosis Cultural Center and also explained to us the meaning of symbiosis. 1969, when I was a student at Ferguson College. I'm also grateful to my senior colleagues who are here, Ambassador Devray, under whom I worked on several occasions, and above all, Dilip Padgaonkar, my friend, mentor, and guide for 45 years. Ambassador Parthasarathy has made some laudatory remarks, and I will attempt to live up to them. The story of India's ties with the Gulf begins with this boat. This boat is a dhow. It used to be made with teak from Malabar more than 2,000 years ago. And since we did not have iron in those days in the Arabian Peninsula, it used to be tied with coir from Malabar. And that is the relationship that we have had with this region. In Oman, when you dig at Sur, you find remains of the Indus Valley civilization. You also find those remains when you go to Bahrain. Indeed, every part of the Arabian Peninsula attests to the historic connectivity that we have. But let us rush on to modern times. And it is these black and grey specks in the waters of the Gulf that have made this region significant. They represent onshore and offshore oil and gas deposits. And from the beginning of the last century, indeed just about 100 years ago, the British Navy shifted from coal to oil. And because they had no oil of their own, they intervened in this region politically and attempted to dominate it. That commences Western hegemony over the Gulf, which in some shape or form continues to this day. Today, because of oil revenues, the Gulf is a very major financial center. It has huge resources that have been generated, that have been utilized for domestic development with regard to the infrastructure and with regard to welfare. There has been a qualitative transformation of the region primarily as a result of these revenues. There are high growth rates because except for a very small blip for a short period in 2008, 2009, oil price, we have found oil prices stabilized at $100 and that has been for several years. And therefore, there is no dearth of revenues available. In many of the countries of the GCC have set up sovereign wealth funds, which are utilized for investments that will have long-term value and will provide sustenance to this region when the oil revenues start diminishing several decades hence. But these sovereign funds are investable funds and therefore a major source of interest to people in different parts of the world, including in Asia. The GCC dominates most of the Arabian Peninsula except for a small corner that is Yemen. Saudi Arabia alone has a size that is two-thirds the size of India. It has 28 million people, of whom 8 million are foreigners, that is Saudis are 20 million. Of all the other countries of the GCC, Indians are dominant. In 3 countries they are the majority. But if you take it as a whole, there is a major interest now across the GCC to set up connectivities, physical, communicational, and various other connectivities that would bring the countries together. And they constitute a very important opportunity and a challenge for those who deal with them. From the point of view of India, our relationship rests on 3 broad principles, 3 broad pillars. Oil. The region provides 50% of India's oil imports, the 6 countries of the GCC. If you take into account Iran and Iraq, it will become 80%. And this is a rapidly increasing demand from India. And as years pass, in the long term, which is 2035, India will depend for overseas imports to the extent of 90%, and almost all of that oil will come from the Gulf. The second is trade and investment connectivities. And the third is our community. Let us take a look at some of these aspects. I have already mentioned energy, trade. The GCC, in terms of economic groupings, is India's #1 trade partner. Year after year, I have been collecting these figures. 6 countries of the GCC put together, import and export from Government of India, compared with all the countries that constitute the European Union, and all the countries that constitute ASEAN, and the 2 major countries that constitute North America, Canada and the United States. The GCC stands head and shoulders above all of them in terms of two-way trade. Investments. There are numerous aspects of our connectivity with regard to investments. It is not as robust as, say, the presence of Korea or the presence of China and now increasingly Japan. Japan used to dominate the scenario along with Western countries in the 70s. But then from the 80s and more importantly from the 90s, it's really Korean companies that came in along with Chinese companies. But we have some important milestones, some important markers. The India-Oman fertilizer project, the Bharat-Oman refinery, and various other projects that we've had. Our strength is in small and medium enterprises. In Saudi Arabia, there are more than 500 Indian small and medium enterprises with a total value of more than $2 billion. Indian companies have now started coming in much more actively. Larsen & Toubro got a major project in Saudi Arabia for $300 million. It's our first major project in that country in 40 years. But what is important about the Gulf is the success of Indian entrepreneurship. The success stories of the GCC are not Indian corporate sector, but the Indians who have set up corporations in those countries. We have great families in Oman who are of Indian origin, the Khimji family, represented here by Mr. Pankaj Khimji. These are giants. They have flown the Indian flag. In the case of Oman, they also have Omani nationality, but they have flown the Indian flag. All across the GCC, services sector, education, medicine, retail, and construction. It's Indian companies that have done extremely well, but these are all remarkable success stories because of the humble origins of the people who founded them. The Indian community is 6.5 million strong in the GCC. It is the number one expatriate community in every country of the GCC. Indeed, it is the preferred community in the GCC. And this community, unhonored, unsung, unremembered frequently mistreated, sends back home $35 billion every year. More than a third of our oil bill is sent home by these humble workers. The profile of our community has been changing in that 20 years ago we were 90% blue collar and 10% white collar but not professional. Today we are 70% blue collar and we are 20% professionals and family members. So there is a significant shift in favor of Indian professionals right across the GCC. Oman again is a great success story because we have at least 150 CEOs, Indian CEOs in Oman, Omani companies. Look at our finance people. The Indian chartered accountant dominates the upper middle level and upper middle level of the corporate sector. They occupy. There are about 800 Indian chartered accountants in Dubai alone and about 300 in Abu Dhabi. I think in the case of Oman also they are very significant, more than 200. So there is a very powerful presence. Why are they welcome? For their integrity and their technical competence. Now, just to summarize, the value, put a financial value on the relationship that we have. I have mentioned to you a two-way trade. Two-way trade was $160 billion. Remittances, $35 billion. You're looking at a relationship between India and the 6 countries of GCC of $200 billion every year. There is no other relationship. And I'm not even taking into account the various investments that are taking place, the crisscross investments. I've also studied another figure, the connectivities. The 6 countries of the GCC send to 15 stations in India 1,100 flights per week one way. And just one country of the GCC, UAE, sends 565 flights. Then I counted with the help of our Air India friends, how many local people must be traveling to India every year. And they gave me certain figures, which I have estimated have been very, very, very modest. I have taken 60% occupancy. I have taken 10% of that as being local people, and yet I have come at a figure which is well over 500,000 people. I think it would be nearer 1 million. 1 million nationals of the GCC are traveling to India every year. And this is something that is increasing. I will tell you, 20 years ago it wasn't the case at all. Now it has changed. People are coming for tourism, for business of course, tourism, and therapy. Kerala has become a very great center for therapy, Ayurveda and spa and various other things, and our people in Kerala are providing extraordinary services in their own home state. Now, look at the future. I look at Government of India documents because we are the world's best document producers. Integrated Energy Policy Document 2006 said that India has to increase its energy requirements, its energy consumption by 7 or 8 times. And therefore they have projected a certain demand for oil and gas. They've given various scenarios. But all those scenarios, there are 10 scenarios in the document. All those scenarios provide for fossil fuels, oil, coal and gas, between 80 to 90%. So we are going to be fossil fuel dependent, coal from home and imported, and oil and gas largely imported, and largely imported from the Gulf. We've also got the Planning Commission, 1 year later, 2007, another outstanding document. This was about the development of our infrastructure. They projected a demand for $500 billion over the next 5 years in order to equip the nation, make it fit to attain growth rates of 8 to 10%. So energy and infrastructure are the two crucial pillars if the nation has to achieve 8 to 10% growth rate. You must have that growth rate if you are going to have. You need those growth rates if you are going to pull people out of poverty and maintain our political and economic order. So there is already a pressure upon me to conclude. I'll just say that the opportunities are very significant, but I'll rapidly come to what I believe in. The theme of this presentation, of this two-day conference, is towards a new paradigm. Let's talk about this new paradigm. There is the vision of an alternative paradigm in regard to the Gulf's relations with the rest of Asia. A new paradigm that has to be based on energy. By 2035, even as the West reduces its consumption of oil and therefore of imports from the Gulf, more and more of this oil and gas is going to go towards Asia, so that by 2035, 90% of Gulf oil production is going to go to Asia. So Asia has a direct interest, a crucial interest, in the security and stability of this region. It also has trade relations, it has investment relations, in our case it has community relations. So these are important. If there is to be a future for India that is important, it is based on the security and stability of this region. But what is happening? So far, there has been Western hegemony, as I mentioned right at the beginning of my presentation. Western hegemony, first by the British and then by the Americans. What has this hegemony meant? War and destruction, intervention, intrusion, and resort to war. This has left the region shattered. Societies have been destroyed. Millions of people have been killed. And this is not a recipe for security and stability. There is a new dawn emerging, and that demands indeed a new security paradigm, a security paradigm that is founded on a larger, broader, more substantial Asian role in Gulf security. And this is based on a vision. Today, more and more, we are significant in this region. It is not something that came out of nowhere. It is a retrieval of what we already had, but which was interrupted by the colonial intervention. And there is a larger vision of which we are all legatees. That is the vision of Jawaharlal Nehru about Asian Renaissance, when all those years ago, in 1947, before we became free, he had a dream of Asian Renaissance that was then destroyed because of the Cold War. Today the Cold War is 20 years behind us, and a new paradigm and a new vision and a wonderful future beckons us. We have to take responsibility. We must play a role, a collective security role that respects the security, that respects the sovereignty of the Gulf countries. We are only catalysts. We are only catalysts who encourage dialogue, mechanisms for dialogue, and confidence-building measures. And we are inspired by the great Indian who had thought about this all those years ago.
Mike.
I think let's move on to Mr. Pooja. We're extremely rare that we have an opportunity in India to welcome a person from Mozambique. Mozambique has a shared vision, history with Goa. Both were subject to Portuguese colonialism. And in fact, I remember this Mozambique leadership from Frelimo, whom I knew in Dar es Salaam, who used to send their people to Goa for inspiration on how to throw out the Portuguese. So, but in the contemporary world, it is an Indian Ocean neighbor and an extremely friendly country with whom we enjoy extremely good relations. So, Mr. Kuto, I would leave it to you to give us some thoughts of how Mozambique looks at the prospects of enhancing its cooperation and understanding with India, particularly on the economic and trade side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, really, I wanted to thank the invitation I got to come here to India and to this conference in the Symbiosis Institute of International Studies. And so far, since I've arrived, it's so good. I have been so welcomed by everybody and by the principal, director, by the vice chancellor, and also yesterday and today I had the chance to listen to the founder and the chancellor of the university, Professor Majumdar. Really, it's so inspirational. I was very much sensitized in seeing how a very simple idea could evolve and turn to be a so big undertaking like Symbiosis University, with so many faculties, so many students coming from everywhere in the world. It's this kind of things that really it's good to join and see, to witness. Really, I thank from the heart Professor Majumdar, but his initiative. It is really good. This is the kind of things that we have to see, not only in India, but everywhere. And it would be good if you could see it in Mozambique also, happening over there. But indeed, it's not very frequent to see these good initiatives that thrive, that prosper. But the battle is that in trying to push this kind of things happening. I'm saying this because really, since we arrived, or today in the conference, we are more or less all of us in agreement and saying very important things. Now we are in a panel on trade and finance, but these main and underlying principles, they continue to be very important. So I want to thank the previous panel and also my colleagues from the panel also from what they had already said. But in saying that, I mean that, well, what has to be said now seems to be shrinking. The margin of what we can say new is really very small. But anyway, I will dare and say something. Maybe counteracting and saying something that is not so good even. But we have to say that, as we are in an academy. I will do that. So dear you all and dear students also, I know that there are some students here in this important, of this important university. In a panel like this on commerce and finance, development and so on, I do think that normally when we talk about these issues, the colleague from Oman has mentioned, first of all, that, well, in trade we have these issues of equality and for investment you have equal opportunities and so and so and so. He mentioned the issue of equality. And I want to take that and say, well, yes, it is that. And the point is that, well, we have to work to build that. To build that. So we are talking about the cooperation between countries, among countries, but they are different countries. So the point is that, well, to have the commerce, to have trade, to have investment, to have finance, sustainable moving over time, it will need to build this equality. What I mean, Mozambique, it was known some years ago and now of being a country that was really much poor. In 1990, the income per capita was something like $80 per capita per annum. $80 in 1990. Now, with all the changes, it's only $600 per capita. Okay? The possibilities of trade, of investment, are limited to this. So it means that, well, Mozambique, to continue to trade, to continue to move with investment, has to invest, has to develop, has to grow, having higher levels of income. And this requires work. So all the engagements that we can have with other countries, they have to contribute in generating the structural transformation that has to happen in Mozambique in order to have a more equilibrated relationship among the countries. For instance, if you take Mozambique and, for instance, a country of the first world, well, you have really a great imbalance. The possibilities of trading sustainably, it's limited, unless Mozambique will also grow. Well, you could say, well, this is with a very developed country. But I would say that, well, this is the same even if you trade with a power like India. Okay? India is a big power in the Indian Ocean. Mozambique is smaller. We have very good relationships from the past. Since now, up to now, it goes on a very good relationship on the right track. But all this, in my view, has to generate the transformation that has to happen in Mozambique in order to have the sustainable continuation of this same relationship. Otherwise, will be just unsustainable. This is my main point. And what I want to say, in realizing that domestically, the government has a strategy in order to trigger, to boost this same transformation. It is now, as has been already mentioned, that, well, the private sector, it's the main engine for growth. Anyway, the private sector develops considering the existence of an environment that is conducive to that. In that environment, you have lots of fundamental pillars. One, in my personal view, is the human capacity. This has been already mentioned by many people here. So there is lots of work that has to be done in Mozambique to develop the human capacity through the education and health systems and water development and so on. This is one fundamental pillar. The other one, it's a kind of infrastructural development that goes from energy, communications, telecommunications, roads, water for industries, and so on. And also, I would include in the first pillar and the second one, technology, applied research and development. That is really quite important. And finally, all the institutional set has to be quite well fit to be friendly to the private sector investment and development. This is something, this is a battle, this is a fight that the government is trying to understand in the last 25 years in reforming. because at the beginning we had a kind of central planned economy in the country, which led to some evolution, positive, but then ended more or less locked. So the reform was needed with some liberalization and with a more serious and focused work in developing either the human capital, infrastructures, as well as the institutional set. These changes that took place is the ones that led to the improvement in the income per capita that we know, that I said from 8 to 600. But at the end of the day, we continue to be really a poor country. We didn't reach yet the middle income country levels. So we continue to be an LDC, I would say. So there is a lot to move forward. Anyway, Mozambique is now for having very high rates of growth, economic growth per annum, rounding for the last 10 years around 7%. Quite similar to what is happening in India, more or less 7% also. But starting from very different levels. We are starting really from we are starting from very different levels, and so we are yet in a very backward stage. But from this very famous growth rate that we have, it's mainly based in public investment, in upgrading the infrastructures, doing the transformation that's needed, but also from private sector. And if we look to the private investment, either domestic and foreign, that it's happening, it goes throughout all the sectors. But in the last few years, we noticed that there is a concentration to the mineral and natural resources investment. It's more, the flows goes to there. This is a point that I wanted to raise and say, okay, this is very welcome, but indeed, in our view, is not a lasting solution. We do need to have investment in mineral resources, but we do need much more also investment in all other critical sectors of activity in order to have a sustainable economy. Mainly recognizing that, well, the mineral resources are exhaustible. In being so, if you want to have a long-lasting economic development that will indeed sustain balanced as well as sustainable over time trade relationship with any partner, including India, it is really required that investment has to flow into all other sectors of activity. And when I say this, I want to mention two important issues. And I think India can help on that, can be very useful. One, it is, okay, we have investment in mining, agriculture, what. It will be very important that also some investments would happen in financial development. I mean in banking and insurance fields, in order to have really availability of finance that will trigger financing of domestic private sector and international there in the country. Without that, it will be difficult. And I want to mention the possibilities of India, because we have some banking investment, but more or less coming from South Africa, Portugal, from Europe, all of them with kind of same culture of financing. And sorry, in certain extent, a bit parasitic. They avoid to invest in poor people. They avoid to invest in small business. And as much as I'm aware, from India you have another experience of investing in very small holder. So this kind of banking, we are really in need of it. So I would encourage Indian companies to move into Mozambique, to invest directly or with partnership in banking and insurance and also financing field in order to contribute for the due structural change that is needed in Mozambique. The second point in this connected with the university symbiosis is the issue of the human capital. India now, it's more visible now in the last 25 years that indeed it's being very well succeed in developing technology, education, like symbiosis. I think this is a big field for investment in Mozambique, including private institutes, private universities like symbiosis. There is an open field for good investment that indeed will bring about the human capacity that's much needed in Mozambique to sustain the innovation that is required sustainably, systematically, to adjust for what are the challenges for the future, whatever it will be. Thank you very much. I cannot continue. Sorry about that.
Symbiosis should get some more engineers good at doing this thing up. We now have Mr. David Rakina, Executive Director of the Exim Bank. For your information, most of our project assistance in specific projects, the financing is done through the Exim Bank, and they have a very key role to play in whatever our external projects are, Mr. Rakina.
Ambassador Parthasarathy, fellow dignitaries on my panel, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Ambassador Devre, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. I need to talk very fast before the nice people over here give me a couple of white slips which say very politely, stop talking, I think. Now, I've been asked to talk about lines of credit. Fair enough. Why are we talking about lines of credit and to Asia and Africa? One of the numbers which often gets lost in the clutter of the media is the seismic shift in our trading pattern. At Exim Bank, our focus is on exports. And if you look at the numbers over the last 10 years, the share of Africa and Asia in our exports has gone up as high as more than 60% from a figure which was below 40% some years ago. Correspondingly, the share of North America and Europe, which used to be well in excess of 50%, has gone down to the 30s. That is one of the reasons why our exports, despite all the noise you see in the media, have not done too badly, because the shift has saved them from the slowdown in the developing economy, in the developed world. Now look at Africa and look at Asia, look at the opportunities. The World Bank has estimated that you need something like $90 billion of investment in Africa every year. About 2/3 of that is for fresh capex, about 1/3 is for maintenance. There isn't anywhere near that sum of money coming into Africa right now, except to the extent of the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and cases like the Government of India's lines of credit, which are given to countries in this area. The same applies to a good part of developing Asia, like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and so on. It's not often known also that India is one of the countries which actually runs a trade deficit with the African continent. Our trade deficit with Africa as a whole is actually larger than our trade deficit with China. Not many people know that either. So let's come down to the lines of credit itself. Mr. Thakur in the morning session talked to you already about the total size of the lines, the projects. So I'm not going to repeat what he said because that would just take up additional time. Let me come down to some actual case studies. It's one thing to say that there's a line of credit, so many $1 million, this project. Fine. What is it doing? Let's talk about Angola. A few years ago, we gave a line of credit to Angola of $40 million. $40 million. Nothing great. Supply of rolling stock, locomotives, carriages, track rehabilitation. Big deal? A very big deal. What happened with that line? See, a railway line is not just an investment in the railway line, it is an investment in moving people and moving goods. Today, you have iron ore from the interior of Angola coming nearer to dispatch because of this railway line. You have farmers in the interior of Angola who are now able to bring their agricultural produce to the urban market, which pays a much higher price and which can absorb a larger share. So suddenly you have development coming up, not just at the terminal points of the line, but all along that line in Angola. That is what that $40 million has done, not just ship locomotives and rolling stock. Let's look at Senegal. We gave a line of credit of $27 million to Senegal. Again, you'll say $27 million, small amount. What did that $27 million do? Now, there's a name which will be familiar to all of us because we're sitting here in Pune, and that name is Kirloskar. People in Africa will tell you that the name Kirloskar is almost synonymous with pump sets. It's that well known. In Senegal, Kirloskar installed a little under 2,400 diesel pump sets in the rice-producing zones of Senegal. What was the impact? Rice cultivation under irrigation in Senegal rose from 24,500 hectares to 65,000 hectares, almost 2.5 times in excess. The rice production increased by 177%. Northern Senegal, which used to import most of its rice production, is now almost entirely self-sufficient thanks to those 2,400 pump sets and that $27 million line of credit. Zambia, let's go to a little wider thing. In Zambia, there was a line of credit, about $10 million, even smaller. Now, this financed the export of vehicles, buses, four-wheel drives, pickup trucks. These were used by the army, the police services. You can't directly come up with a developmental counterpart for this. But this means that there is greater security, there is greater policing, there is greater safety of the population in Zambia, thanks to this $10 million line of credit. That is what I talk about impact. It's not just the money. This is the partnership in development where India shares what it has learned with these countries. The money is incidental. It is the impact which matters. Look at Asia, in Myanmar as well. We financed through a line of credit Tata Motors $20 million to set up a truck manufacturing plant in Myanmar. Now, this has contributed in a remote area of Myanmar to the economic development, and almost 60% of the workers in this plant are women. In Myanmar, you'll find that women do a lot of the participation in the economy, and this has helped tremendously in transforming that area. If you land at Yangon Airport and move into the city, center of the city, you'll find a large Tata Motors dealership on the way. So what is the impact of all these? I'm trying to suggest that what we are sharing is our developmental experience. The money, the line of credit, Exim Bank, the project is merely a vehicle for the sharing of experience and this joint learning. Now, it's not just lines of credit. Lines of credit is one window. With the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, we have worked out another window, the buyer's credit under the trust fund set up by the ministry, that is the National Export Insurance Account. Whereas the lines of credit are directly to sovereign governments, the buyer's credit can be extended to a private sector party, preferably with some kind of a backup support from the sovereign government. One of the biggest beneficiaries of this is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has used this particular product for water projects in the war-torn parts of the country to improve water distribution, to improve railway distribution, and so on. If you look at the total commitments by way of lines of credit, buyer's credit, the number one country in the whole world of recipient of assistance is Sri Lanka. The second is Ethiopia. The third is Mozambique. The fourth is Myanmar. So you have a nice balance between Asia and Africa, which is building up very steadily. Apart from the buyer's credit, we also realize that in many parts of the developing world, you have project potential. I talked to you about the numbers. You look at Africa, for example. The land area of Africa is 10 times the land area of India. But the population and GDP of Africa is almost exactly the same as the population and GDP of India. The rail route network in India is larger than the rail route network in all of Africa. Now just imagine the development potential and the business potential in the railway sector alone, not the other sectors. Just imagine the amount of potential there, how much of development can occur, and how much of business potential there is there for local companies in Africa as well as for Indian companies. So what we've done is we've promoted a joint venture company with Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services of India and the African Development Bank. What is this company going to do? It's going to identify business opportunities in Africa. It is going to pick what is going to be the most productive use of this project, do the environmental study, do the technical assistance, do the detailed project report, prepare a dossier of all the documents and studies which are needed to make this project a success, and make this dossier available to the highest bidder. Hopefully that bidder is from India, it may be from somewhere else, it doesn't matter. The project will then get made because it will be financed. If it is an Indian bidder, I'm happy to finance it. If it's from another country, I'm sure that country is happy to finance it, or the African Development Bank will finance. But it bridges the gap between the potential and the need and the actualization on the ground. That is what this company is going to do. We're also looking at financing investment into Africa. We can talk about projects. Your projects, you're in, you do the project, you create the capability, you're out. But for a long-term commitment, it is when you actually set up a joint venture, a subsidiary, you take over a company, you participate with a local partner. I'm particularly proud of some of the projects we've done there. In the highlands of Ethiopia, we financed a small project. The total commitment is perhaps not even $0.6 million. What are they doing? They're making woolen blankets. They're taking coarse wool from the sheep in the Ethiopian highlands, spinning the wool, making coarse woolen blankets to keep people warm in the heights of winter. No great technology, nothing spectacular, except that it is an Indian SME and your Ethiopian SME which have got together to blend the strengths of both countries and contribute to the development of the people over there. In fact, on the road out of Addis Ababa, if you're traveling out to the interior, you will find Indian projects in the area of steel, in the area of sugar, in the area of agriculture, in the area of textiles as well. And that is where we are sharing our partnership. Last but not least, I've so far escaped the white slip. Last but not least is our research activities. I would invite all of you, please visit our website. If you're looking at building up your knowledge of these areas, if you're looking at identifying opportunities and building on those opportunities, then the Exim Bank website is a wealth of information for you. You will find detailed studies on the trade and investment potential between India and the countries of Africa, specific studies on West Africa, specific studies on Iran, on Myanmar, on Pakistan, on Sri Lanka, on Bangladesh. It gives you the start which you need to take that step further. That is what Exim Bank is trying to do. We are essentially a catalyst. We work with the government of India, different ministries. We work with Indian exporters. We are building up Indian exports, definitely. We are not yet reached the stage of the Nordic countries. Maybe someday we'll reach that exalted level where India is in a position of providing assistance which is not tied. Today our assistance is tied. Nothing to be ashamed about that. We are promoting Indian exports, but in the process we are also sharing our development experience. Thank you very much, and I hope many of you students will one day be in this area. Thank you.
We've got Dr. Sachin Chaudhary before we move on to paper presentations. Dr. Sachin Chaudhary next. He is from the Research and Information Systems, works with Mr. Shyam Saran, and will now be presenting his paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, would like to thank Ambassador Devre for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to address three important issues, and then would just like to wind up in 10 minutes or so. One important thing that at the outset we should realize is this fact that we are at a point when there is a tectonic shift in the global power relations. Since morning we have heard several speakers referring to it, and I think it's very important to realize that there are three important implications of this change in paradigm. Number one is the expansion in the South-South cooperation. The countries from the South are collaborating, not only in terms of the development assistance, which you heard in this session, specific examples of it, but the second and more important is the trade and finance linkage, which has expanded exponentially in last 20 years or so. This is largely because of course, the rapid economic expansion in the so-called emerging economies of BRICS. But at the same time, we also find even smaller developing countries, say Tanzania or others, which are not that small but are playing very important role in terms of expansion of South-South cooperation. So trade and investment linkages have expanded. South-South cooperation's share in the global trade, which was only something like 21% in 1990, stands somewhere close to 52% at this point. The share in investment, which was only 12%, now stands at 22% of the global investment flows. So that's the quantum we are talking of in terms of expansion. Second important implication is in terms of desire to play an important role in rule setting at the global level. So be that WTO, we already saw what happened in Bali, but also in sector-specific domains like WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, climate talks, and many other examples are there where emerging economies are increasingly playing an important role in terms of setting up of standards. And I would come back to this in context of development cooperation. Third and more important, I think, important trend is in terms of divergence within South. So the South, which we talked about in 70s and 80s, which non-aligned movement aligned it with, is something very different now. That South with expansion in economy, with expansion in trade interest, in specializations, has diversified. So that South of emerging economies and the rest of the South, these are two separate categories we need to understand and bring them on board when we talk of development cooperation. When the World Economic Forum came out with a report just last year, two major challenges it identified for global economy. One is in terms of inequality, which I just referred to, in terms of expansion in economic growth terms in certain emerging economies. And second is in terms of governance failures all across developing world. In more or less, these are the two challenges they have spelled out in detail with empirical evidence. So this, I think, is a major challenge when we are providing development assistance. David referred to the project-based assistance we are providing to developing countries. I think we would have to take a far more broader view in terms of our assistance to these countries. I feel it is not confined, and Abhay also explained in the morning, the three traditional ways of our engagement. And the first one, they said, is capacity building. Second is in terms of providing grants. So the projects which are there in terms of providing impetus to development are largely backed by grants. The third is in terms of LOCs, which David explained. But apart from these three, I think two more we should not miss out. And that forms a larger idea on which we are working at RIS, is in terms of developing the concept of development compact. So our relationship with our partner countries is manifesting what is called as development compact. And this development compact brings in not only these three traditional tools of engagement, but two additional tools. And they are trade and investment. They are integrated in this whole process. So if we are providing lines of credit, and that is giving us sort of trade to our companies, at the same time we have to see how we can build up on that. And I give you one example. I had an opportunity of being in Mozambique to study Indian lines of credit in Mozambique. One example that I came across was this excellent project India implemented in terms of producing solar panels. And solar panel is an important tool in terms of providing energy security to rural areas in Mozambique, but at the same time is also India's contribution in terms of reducing dependence on fossil fuels and other sources of traditional power sources. So from that point of view, if you see what mechanisms are required by Mozambique to safeguard their trade interests, we know one or two major economies from the south are flooding their solar panels all across, not only in our parts of the world, but also in developed countries. In fact, they have been dragged to a WTO dispute panel now, and the case is being fixed. So from that point of view, when we are providing assistance to Mozambique for producing solar panel, we also need to safeguard how Mozambique can continue to produce that and use that opportunity to export solar panel to other countries. So policy support in terms of safeguarding market interests are extremely important. The people who are providing lines of credit on behalf of India would just do that project and would come out, would see that the money that India has lended is coming back, and that's it. I think as a development partner, our responsibility goes one step further. And that's what development compact signifies. And that's where trade and finance assume far more greater importance than looking them in separate brackets. That suits developed countries very well. It is not in interest of developing countries. And why I'm saying so, when we see USAID or DFID talking about food security in developing countries, immediately they ask their national governments to scale up assistance in agriculture sector, which they sometimes oblige. And you know, Clinton launched the Food Security Initiative for Africa and called upon India to supplement U.S. efforts in African security. But what's the point if U.S. is multiplying their subsidy to their own farmers by several leaps and bounds, which are overcrossing the limits for which they are providing development assistance in agriculture sector? So policy coherence from that point of view is extremely important, and I think is crux for development finance linkage that we have. Those of you who have background in economics would appreciate when Chenery and Stewart came up with the two-gap development model. The idea was that foreign exchange is limited with these countries. And unfortunately, throughout 60s and 70s, most of the developing countries imported far more capital-intensive goods than their exports. And as a result, they ended up with the balance of payment crisis quite frequently. 70s, 80s, 90s, several developing countries have gone through this kind of crisis. And as a result, the development finance or aid was prescribed as a solution. In case of South, that's not the option, and that's not the philosophy. And let me spend 1 minute on what is the distinction. Very often we refer to this idea of South-South cooperation and North-South cooperation. In the morning we heard that we are different in the South because we are demand-driven, because we provide equal opportunity for growth, it's mutual interest. But I think the distinction is far deeper. And since there are several students, I would encourage you to see the literature, particularly by Raul Prebisk, who has extensively articulated this position. But a recent book by a Japanese economist, Yanagi Hara, has brought out this fact, and this I think is very interesting rationale to see the distinction at the theoretical level between North-South and South-South. Yanagi Hara says that one is a framework approach and another is constituent approach. So framework approach is the European or DAC country approach, in which you try to see macroeconomic variables in shape. So you assume that economic growth is possible only when macroeconomic variables are in order. As a result, Washington Consensus tells you that macroeconomic variables should be A, B, C, D. And they would say deficit financing should be this much, balance of payment difference should be this much, and they give you numbers. And as a result, the whole origin of the concept of conditionalities with aid. That's not the theory that we ascribe in South-South cooperation. Raul Prebisk and later on Yanagi Hara, they explain that this philosophy of South-South cooperation says that economic growth is possible even when we have disequilibrium in the economy. So even if macroeconomic variables are not in place, we can still grow. And as a result, most of the South-South cooperation assistance is in terms of projects, is in terms of providing support, which is immediately in terms of ensuring development cooperation for the partner countries. So from that standpoint, the assistance that we are providing doesn't have conditionalities. So that's true for India, that's true for China, Brazil, South Africa. Whatever major economic assistance provider you see, you would find that as a reality, as a truth. Last point that I wish to emphasize, as I have already got the slip, is in terms of role that CSOs play, and Ambassador Shamsaran alluded to that in his talk in the morning, is in terms of how we can open up the sector. At RIS, we have formed what we are calling as FIDC, Forum for Indian Development Cooperation, and I would really welcome Symbiosis and other institutions to join in this effort. It's a tripartite forum in which we have DPA, we have academics, and we have civil society. All the three are meeting every month. We have a monthly seminar series in Delhi, which is hosted at RIS, where we discuss this issue of conditionalities, where we discuss the issue of role that CSOs can play. In fact, Bankar Roy's example in terms of providing education through Barefoot College is an excellent example, but how we can scale it up, how we can bring in more civil society organizations in this, and bring in sort of watchdog as well. Like, for instance, when when again I go back to my experience in Mozambique, I saw a line of credit from Exim Bank for providing borewells all across Mozambique, some $450 million line of credit. Borewells are fine, but we have seen in Maharashtra itself and then also in Tamil Nadu what havoc they can create to environmental balance. So India would have to see what we are living there. And I was quite pleasantly surprised when this morning I met Dr. Manju Singh, and she has worked on evaluation from Symbiosis University of our domestic projects. I think we need to bring in methodologies which are sensitive to this idea of impact evaluation. So this is, I think, extremely important for academics to step up their efforts in terms of bringing in methodologies which are sensitive to the principles of South-South cooperation. If you scan through economic literature or even literature of project management, you would find that most of the methodologies, conceptual frameworks, are from northern donors. So they reflect their ideas and their concerns on development assistance and not of South-South cooperation. So academics has a long way to go. Thank you.
We're getting late. I would request the last two speakers to bear with us because I've been threatened by Symbiosis that I'll not be called to the chair in future because we're going beyond time. Thanks. The first paper would be on an Indian model of aid, rethinking policy perspectives. This would be by Dr. Faisal Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, I would request, please let's keep it short and sweet.
Just 5 minutes. Yeah? No, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Parthasarathy. I'll try to keep it short, but I don't know whether I can keep it sweet. This is, I just came to know across several literatures that we have been talking about that there is no Indian model of aid actually. Does India actually has a model of aid? Do we know of any such model? So I just thought I'll try to figure out what are the ingredients, what are the points in it. If we see we know about the South-South cooperation which has been much discussed, and there have been various institutional frameworks like the Buenos Aires Plan of Action and the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda and all. If we see India as a donor, much of our aid is integrated with trade and investment. So it will be difficult to create that thin line between aid, trade and investment. For instance, those related to trade preferences for least developed countries, funding of infrastructure, concessional lines of credit, technical cooperation and things like that. But anyway, South-South cooperation has to be based and relied on the national development policies of the countries. There have been various efforts to sustainability. I'll just go through it quickly. That like we already announced the duty-free, quota-free, duty-free tariff preferences, market access to least developed countries on 85% of the tariff lines in way back in April 2008. And many other countries like China and Brazil have also been doing it. Just we have a look at this India's trade with ECOWAS. Now, if we see India's trade with ECOWAS, this is the data of the export and the import. We find that the import is has been increasing over the years. Now, it simply talks about providing a market access. If we talk about SADC, India's trade with SADC, again we see that import has been increasing. India's import from Bangladesh, Bhutan and Nepal, we find that it has been increasing. So simply we can say that we are not necessarily based on a donor-recipient relationship, but it's a relationship based on equal partnership. Some of the areas in which we work are humanitarian assistance, education and capacity building. Then we have technical assistance. These are the three areas that we work on, which is given in the middle of this graph. And below that, we have the three institutions that are there, Ministry of Finance and the Exim Bank and the newly formed Department of Development Partnership Administration in the MEA. And on the top, you see some of the countries which are actually recipients or partners in the process of development. About line of credit, just few points I'll mention that as per RBI guidelines, the bank's aggregate resource raising by means of borrowing is subject to the prescribed ceiling of 10 times of the bank's net owned fund. Now, this limits the financing capability of the Exim Bank actually, because it cannot finance to that extent because it is limited to only 10% of its net owned worth. Secondly, in this financial year, government has infused a capital of around 700 crores to increase the credit capacity. But these things are actually insignificant if we compare to other countries which are a major donors, or we can say major providers of development assistance in the South-South cooperation mechanism. Moreover, Exim Bank maintains a profit margin of 2% and which is just above the competitive credit, just ensuring that in order to ensure that competitive credit mechanism, maybe this margin can be looked at so that we can find the venues of cheaper borrowings from the market. Then we have it was said that many countries do not follow, or even we do not follow the export financing guidelines or things like that of the OECD. Exim Bank gives line of credit which is just better at a rate which is just better than the commercial loan rate. But if we just compare this with other donors like China or maybe other countries, but China is giving at a competitive rate and the grace period is very high. So we also need to maybe look at this angle as well to ensure that we are able to, look forward to a smooth functioning of the line of credit. And $5 billion to African countries, which will line of credit which was allocated, which is to expire in 2014, is still unused. This is actually attributed to the lack of. Even private sector does not find it very attractive in terms of the higher profit margins. I'll just like to add one or two more points that we don't look at a donor-recipient relationship, that is true. And as per the South-South cooperation initiatives, we do look at it. Just let us see that how do we manage proliferation of funding channels? In terms of aid and development assistance, how do we manage the proliferation of funding channels, and how do we evaluate the impact and delivery mechanism? If we need to look at these things, and we need to revisit our philosophy of development cooperation actually, about which we have been talking about since morning. We need to revisit to ensure that our strategic control on our own resources is there. Can it ensure our own strategic control on our own resources? Why I say so? Because we don't give aid. We want mutual benefit. So if we want mutual benefit, we must have a strategic control on our own resources. If we are giving it aid, then probably we don't need a strategic control. We have given it to some other country, and we don't need to evaluate that what is the amount of, or what is the amount of impact or outcome that aid has created for that particular country. But if we are looking for a mutual benefit, we must look at mechanisms by which we are able to evaluate that. And one more point, like Ambassador Talmiz Ahmed mentioned about the Saudi Arabia and the ODA, about the India GCC partnership, and I was a consultant to United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, and I did a study on South-South cooperation, in which I found that Saudi Arabia is not among the major donors of any of the Arab countries. And another instance that we found about the regional disparity of the flow of aid, we will be surprised to see about the huge regional disparity which exists among the regional trade blocs as well. For instance, in the Arab League, we see Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Comoro, which is another, or Mauritania on the other hand. We see India on the one hand and we see Bhutan on the other hand. We see Singapore on the one hand in Southeast Asia, and we see Laos PDR, which is a landlocked country in Southeast Asia on the other hand. So unless we try to incorporate the development partnership mechanism negotiations as part of our regional agreements, probably it will be very difficult to develop a regional framework on development partnership. We can only go for a bilateral level framework, which may not be so, useful, because ultimately we can take the example of the Africa peer review mechanism in Africa, which is another very good example of South-South cooperation. I thank you for your attention. Sorry.
It was short and sweet. We'll now come to the last paper for this, a comparison of Indian and Chinese experiences by Dr. Sukalpa Chakraborty.
Good afternoon, Honorable Speaker, distinguished speakers, the Honorable Chair, dignitaries of the dais, and people attending this conference. Welcome to Symbiosis. This is a paper that has been co-authored with me by Professor Ishita Ghosh, who's sitting on the aisle. We'll try to be as fast as possible because it's tea time. What our paper has been highlighting has been mainly focuses on the fact that over the last decade, there has been a gradual but marked shift in the main donors of FDI in terms of funding for Africa from the traditional Western developed countries towards the BRICS nations. Our paper has done a comparison of the investment activities carried out by China and India in the context of development cooperation in Africa. Since we are short of time, I'm trying to run through this. A quick look at the facts which show the fantastic opportunities that Africa promises for any investor country as of today. So it's but natural that both India and China, the two Asian giants, have come up with clearly articulated investment strategy for the continent. India and China have steadily become major players in Africa, creating significant opportunities and changes in Africa's traditional trade and investment. Natural resources, infrastructure, textile, information, and communication technology alongside automobiles and social sectors are some of the major areas that have received the fillip from this FDI. But in stark contrast to these optimistic projections, Africa, we find, is still struggling in the realization of the Millennium Development Goals and needs partners for capacity building and expertise sharing, a vital area where we find both India and China cooperating. The Millennium Development Goals include development cooperation as one of the 8 goals, and that has been a prime focus of our paper. I'll not get into what development cooperation stands for, but from the perspective of both India and China, we find the countries emphasizing on working together for a common good, wherein the priorities will be determined by the recipient. And the focus is on long-term capacity building through a consultative process that would lead to a symbiotic interdependency. I'll take a moment. Okay. I'll quickly jump over to our next part of the paper, which focuses on FDI, the nature of FDI flows in Africa. And according to IMF estimates, the total Indian investments in Africa at the end of 2011 were US $14.1 billion, a share of 22.5% in total Indian outward FDI stock. It's safe to assume that it's a sizable proportion of the total outflows, and Indian multinational corporations have ventured into both greenfield and brownfield investments, spanning telecom, energy, computer services, power, and automobile sector, among others. The Indian private sector organizations under the stewardship of CII have been active in Africa since the early 2000s and have been promoting public-private partnerships. In case of China, we find that it has been a third largest outward investor globally since 2011 and has been impacting a much stronger role in Africa as compared to India. Now, what we've gathered from our findings across the nature of FDI flows is that there are a lot of challenges and opportunities that would be facing both India and China as they compete for a development role in Africa. We have talked about the advantages of investing in Africa. Let's now talk about the deterrents that stare us in the face. The first deterrent comes in the aspect of transport and logistics in terms of costs, poor business environment, access to capital, absence of bilateral investment treaties, smaller market size, informal controls, and corrupt practices. Ernst & Young have also noted that Africa still suffers from a poor image among foreign investors. Now, we find that the African nations have been quick to change their image and have come up with a lot of benchmarking in terms of coming up as reformers, strong reformers, and well-functioning institutions with very low levels of corruption across many African states. Now, our comparison has shown that India and China have been quick to adopt development cooperation as part of their larger strategy of fostering global economic and political linkages. Apart from energy, both Sino-Indian engagements with Africa is driven by the prime motives to strengthen their respective clout in Africa in terms of international political order. Now, given that we are neighboring countries and we are competing with each other, our finding has been that India needs to scale up her bilateral investments in the region across resource-rich as well as resource-poor countries in Africa and bring in technology that is affordable, appropriate, and adaptable. And that would be our aim towards a new paradigm in terms of African partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we started 15 minutes late or 20 minutes late. We're finishing 12 minutes late. So I think we've reasonably kept within our time. Just a couple of points I want to mention. The way our economy is structured and what we are going through at the present moment, I think ultimately the development cooperation we extend, the capacity building we extend, produces the goodwill and the political structures in Africa and in the Gulf to promote our investments, which necessarily has to be through the private sector. The Exim Bank is a catalyst, but ultimately the bigger corporates would go to the international markets for the money they get. So development cooperation remains essential, and I think we're doing a reasonably good job at it, in getting people to understand India and therefore become amenable to transacting business with India. But I think business should be left to business. And I'm not being unfair, but when government and government corporations get overly involved to the detriment of the private sector, I don't think it produces optimum efficiency in project. Economic projects and investment. So on that happy note, I think we've done reasonably well, and I think we should just keep trying. But the concept of development administration has changed. Contrary to popular belief, the Ministry of External Affairs and our diplomatic missions today spend much more time promoting development cooperation, trade and investment than they do in politics. This is horrible. I just say I'm sorry, but I can't be responsible for mics which don't work.
Thank you, sir, for conducting the session. May I now request the chairperson to kindly felicitate the dignitaries on the dais. Thank you, sir. I would like to request Dr. Pranav Mukherjee, Director, Symbiosis Institute of International Business, to kindly felicitate Ambassador Partha Sarthi.